In December 2025, a landlocked nation under sanctions suddenly built most of a massive 8-lane highway in barely 40 days. For over 60 years, it had struggled to pave even a few thousand kilometers of road, yet this single project advanced faster than entire national eras of construction. Why are global observers suddenly paying attention to Ibrahim Traoré, and what are they seeing that suggests this project could signal a deeper shift in how power and infrastructure work? Because the next developments may redefine assumptions dramatically far beyond one country. You are about to hear a reality most public discussions only hint at but rarely unpack in full. You will gain a clearer lens on what is actually shifting. This is not casual information. Ignore what comes next, and it becomes easy to accept surface explanations that sound reasonable yet miss the underlying mechanics shaping events. Without a deeper frame of reference, rapid infrastructure, sudden policy moves, and unusual economic signals can look like isolated headlines instead of parts of a coordinated pattern. That misunderstanding carries a cost because people who rely only on simplified narratives often misjudge timing, risk, and direction when real-world changes accelerate. Those who grasp the structure early, however, tend to recognize signals sooner, interpret decisions more accurately, and anticipate consequences before they become obvious to everyone else. What follows is designed to give that structural clarity so the situation can be seen as it actually is, not as it is casually described. The event many assumed was symbolic was operational, and it unfolded far faster than standard infrastructure timelines would normally allow. In roughly 40 days, progress reached about 70% of a 330-kilometer expressway corridor. A pace that immediately raised questions among observers tracking regional development patterns. Ibrahim Traoré was suddenly at the center of analytical discussions not because of rhetoric, but because measurable activity on the ground suggested a break from past implementation speeds. To understand why that matters, the background is essential but simple. The country gained independence in 1960, and across 62 years it constructed roughly 3,000 kilometers of paved roads nationwide. That figure is not dramatic until placed beside geography and population. A landlocked territory of about 23 million people, with road coverage barely comparable to a single transcontinental route if laid end-to-end. Infrastructure assessments reflected that limitation, with an African Development Bank index placing the national score at 22.11 out of 124, the highest it had ever recorded. The situation did not become significant overnight. It intensified because long-standing structural patterns shaped how projects were financed and executed. Traditional procurement models often involve layered contracting chains in which initial contractors, subcontractors, import costs, and administrative delays steadily reduced the portion of funds reaching actual construction. That system created a pattern where projects moved slowly, budgets expanded, and results appeared disconnected from original expectations. The first groups affected were not foreign observers or analysts, but local populations whose daily mobility, trade access, and service delivery depended directly on transport networks. When road systems lag, everything else slows with them. Goods, emergency response, education access, and market integration. That is why sudden acceleration in infrastructure is never just about asphalt, it is an early indicator that something deeper inside a national decision structure may have shifted. A field engineer interviewed during the early phase described crews working continuously, day and night, 7 days a week, at what he called an infernal rhythm. That description matters because it confirms the change was not theoretical or announced policy alone, it was visible in labor patterns, machine deployment, and physical progress across terrain. When tempo changes first, systems often follow. A central figure quickly emerged as the reference point guiding interpretation of these developments. Ibrahim Traoré became the lens through which observers tried to understand whether this acceleration reflected a temporary push or a structural shift in how national projects were conceived and executed. His relevance did not come from symbolism alone, but from proximity to the decisions shaping financing, logistics, and implementation speed. One early moment illustrates this influence clearly. When projected costs for a major highway were reportedly estimated by contractors at around 3,000 billion CFA francs, a figure far beyond what the national budget could reasonably absorb, the proposal appeared effectively stalled. The leadership path chosen redirected strategy toward bypassing conventional contract chains altogether and prioritizing domestic execution capacity. A second confirming signal came soon after. Rather than importing full external teams, heavy machinery was acquired and local young operators were trained to run it. That choice shifted the operational center of gravity from unmanaged execution to internal technical mobilization. It also meant that progress speed would depend primarily on domestic coordination rather than layered contractual schedules. These early indicators suggested that the development was not an isolated construction story, but part of a broader administrative experiment. But whether similar approaches might appear in other sectors if the model proved right. From that moment, the situation no longer looked routine. It started with a decision. Cost projections landed. The numbers shocked planners. 3,000 billion quoted. Negotiations expected. They never came. Instead, the plan flipped. Ibrahim Traoré bypassed contractors. Internal execution activated. Machines ordered immediately. 200 for units acquired. Bulldozers, excavators, graders, trucks. Deployment schedules compressed. Training began instantly. Local youth recruited. Operators formed in weeks. No external crews flown in. Command chain shortened. Instructions centralized. Timelines tightened. Ground clearing began. Survey lines drawn. Markers planted. Engines ignited. Dust rose. Convoys moved. Segments opened. Kilometers fell quickly. Observers noticed. Reports circulated. Analysts recalculated. 40 days passed. 232 kilometers cleared. Nearly 70% done. Progress stunned monitors. Regional planners reacted. Comparisons surfaced. Past timelines revisited. Assumptions weakened. Forecast models shifted. Pressure spread outward. Institutions questioned methods. Commentators debated sustainability. Supporters cited efficiency. Critics raised safeguards. Both sides watched closely. Meanwhile, crews kept moving. Day shifts blurred. Night shifts continued. Machines rotated. Fuel flowed. Signals relayed. Supervisors tracked. Output climbed. The aftershock phase began quietly. Expectations changed first. Then benchmarks. Then comparisons. What once looked impossible now looked measurable. What seemed exceptional began to look repeatable. And once a process appears repeatable, it stops being an event and starts becoming a precedent. Before this phase, national infrastructure output followed a slow historical baseline measured across decades rather than weeks. After the shift, the comparison point changed dramatically. Progress that once accumulated across years began appearing within days, forcing analysts to reassess what the true operating capacity might be when bottlenecks are removed. Ibrahim Traoré entered the discussion again at this stage because observers were no longer asking whether the project was fast, they were asking what structural variables had been altered to make that speed possible. One scale indicator stands out first. Over a 62-year period, the country built roughly 3,000 kilometers of paved roads. That figure defines the baseline. It represents the inherited pace of national infrastructure development across generations. When analysts compare that historical total to reports that current planning aims to approach similar output within a single year, the contrast frames the discussion from rapid project to systemic acceleration. A second metric highlights intensity rather than size. Approximately 57 tons of gold were produced in one recent year, placing the country among Africa's top producers. This matters because gold accounts for roughly 70 to 80% of exports and about 15 to 20% of government revenue. The national economy is heavily tied to a single resource stream. When that stream is redirected or captured more efficiently, fiscal capacity can shift quickly. A third figure grounds the human impact dimension. Estimates indicate that about $4.9 billion were lost over a decade through illicit financial flows linked to the gold sector. That number is not a what-I'm theft, it represents gradual leakage across years. It suggests that funds equivalent to multiple national infrastructure programs may have exited the system without appearing in public budgets. When placed side by side, these numbers change how the situation feels. Speed and consequence simultaneously. The issue stops sounding like a headline about construction and starts resembling a measurable transformation in how resources, policy decisions, and execution capacity interact. At that point, the question is no longer whether something unusual is happening, but how far its effects could extend if the underlying conditions persist. Some observers approach this situation from a different angle, and their perspective deserves careful consideration before any conclusions are drawn. They argue that rapid state-driven infrastructure, especially under centralized authority, can introduce risks that are not immediately visible during early success phases. In their view, speed alone is not proof of sustainability, and historical examples show that fast execution can sometimes conceal structural weaknesses. One strong criticism focuses on quality assurance. Skeptics note that when projects move at exceptional speed, independent audits, engineering inspections, and environmental assessments may struggle to keep pace. Their concern is not that progress is impossible, but that durability, maintenance planning, and long-term safety standards might be harder to verify in real time. From that standpoint, the question is not whether a highway can be built quickly, but whether it will still perform reliably years later under heavy use and climate stress. A second serious argument centers on financial structure. Critics point out that tying infrastructure expansion closely to commodity revenue, such as gold income, can create vulnerability because commodity prices fluctuate. If global prices fall or production drops due to security or logistical disruptions, funding streams may tighten suddenly. Under that scenario, projects launched during high revenue periods could face maintenance or completion challenges later. Supporters counter that these concerns, while valid, must be weighed against historical comparison points. Previous development frameworks often included formal oversight and international participation on paper. Yet large sums still leaked from systems and infrastructure growth remained slow. When both viewpoints are placed side by side, the picture becomes clearer. The debate is less about whether one model is flawless and more about which risks are visible, which are hidden, and which trade-off societies are willing to accept to change long-standing outcomes. Everything changed at once. What shifted the trajectory was not only construction speed, but a deeper development that many early observers overlooked. As financial flows tied to natural resources began moving more directly into national channels, the underlying engine powering infrastructure suddenly looked different from what analysts had assumed at the start. Ibrahim Traoré appeared again at the center of attention because this stage suggested the highway was not the cause of change, but the visible result of an earlier decision chain. Reports indicated that state-controlled gold collection rose from about 8 tons in one year to roughly 11 tons within just the first quarter of the next. That kind of jump, occurring over such a short span, signals more than routine variation. It suggests that revenue capture mechanisms themselves may have shifted, allowing a larger share of extracted value to remain inside the national system rather than dispersing outward through previous channels. The implication of that change is straightforward but powerful. When resource income stays within domestic budgets, governments gain flexibility to allocate funds toward projects that previously depended on external financing or lengthy approval structures. In practical terms, that means machinery can be purchased sooner, labor can be mobilized faster, and project timelines can be compressed without waiting for layered negotiations. This midpoint moment reframes everything that came before. What initially looked like a surprising construction story now resembles the visible surface of a broader structural adjustment. And once that possibility enters the analysis, every subsequent development is interpreted differently. Because observers are no longer watching a road being built. They are watching a system being tested. The consequences did not remain confined to planning rooms or construction zones. Its effects began appearing across practical layers of society, revealing how a single structural adjustment can ripple outward into governance, markets, daily life, and regional positioning. Ibrahim Traoré was discussed in policy circles again at this stage, not as a symbol, but as a reference point for interpreting how those ripples might continue. At the state level, decision pressure intensified. Faster execution creates expectations, and expectations reshape political timelines. Authorities responsible for budgeting, oversight, and national planning suddenly faced a new benchmark for what counts as fast or possible. Success strengthens legitimacy, yet higher expectations reduce tolerance for future delays. In effect, the government becomes tied to the performance standard it has demonstrated. Businesses felt a different kind of shift. Transport infrastructure directly affects logistics costs, delivery reliability, and investment forecasts. When major corridors improve, supply chains can shorten, transit times can drop, and regional trade calculations change. Even before completion, anticipation alone can influence how companies plan routes, pricing, and expansion strategies. Markets respond not just to finished roads, but to credible signals that those roads are coming. For ordinary citizens, the impact is more immediate and tangible. Roads determine access to jobs, hospitals, schools, and markets. When connectivity improves, travel time decreases, and economic participation becomes easier. Goods arrive sooner, services reach farther, and opportunities that once felt distant move within reach. In this sense, is not abstract policy, it is daily life translated into distance and time. Regionally, the implications extend beyond national borders. The country sits at a geographic crossroads linking inland territories to coastal trade routes. Strengthening a major internal corridor can therefore influence how neighboring states move goods toward ports, potentially shifting trade flows across a wider zone. They can increase bargaining leverage in regional commerce simply by offering faster or more reliable transit options. When all four layers are viewed together, a pattern emerges. The development is not isolated to asphalt or machinery. Its effects touch governance expectations, commercial calculations, household routines, and cross-border dynamics at the same time. Once that happens, the situation stops being a single project and becomes a structural event whose influence extends far beyond its physical footprint. Looking ahead, the most probable trajectory is neither dramatic collapse nor instant transformation, but a measured continuation shaped by constraints as much as ambition. If current conditions hold, infrastructure expansion is likely to proceed in phases, with periods of rapid activity followed by slower consolidation while financing, maintenance planning, and technical verification catch up. In that baseline scenario, momentum remains real yet uneven, producing visible gains without eliminating structural pressures. Ibrahim Traoré would, under this path, continue to be assessed primarily on whether early acceleration can translate into sustained delivery rather than short bursts. A more optimistic scenario depends on several reinforcing factors aligning. Resource revenues would need to remain stable, administrative coordination would have to stay efficient, and technical standards would need consistent enforcement. If those elements hold together, early projects could create a confidence loop. Visible results attract investment interest, improved infrastructure lowers operating costs, and reduced costs stimulate further growth. Under that chain reaction, the initial project becomes less important than the system it proved possible. The most difficult scenario emerges if key supports weaken simultaneously. Commodity price drops, security disruptions, or internal bottlenecks could tighten funding and slow execution, when large programs depend heavily on a narrow revenue base. Volatility can translate quickly into delays or scaling back. In that environment, expectations built during rapid progress risk turning into pressure if timelines lengthen or results plateau. What matters most is not predicting which path will occur, but recognizing that all three remain plausible depending on decisions made now. Strategic awareness comes from tracking signals early, understanding what drives them, and staying prepared to adjust expectations as new data appears. The future is rarely decided by a single outcome, it is shaped by how well societies prepare for several at once. After seeing the broader landscape in the range of possible futures, the most important question becomes personal rather than geopolitical. What does all of this actually mean for someone watching from the outside? Large structural shifts often feel distant until their effects filter down into everyday experience, yet understanding them early can quietly change how people interpret news, risk, and opportunity long before outcomes become obvious. For those who actively follow global developments, this moment offers an informational advantage. They are able to connect signals that others might see as unrelated headlines and recognize patterns forming beneath them. But it does provide context, and context is often the difference between reacting late and understanding early. Staying attentive to reliable data sources and watching how indicators evolve can help this group maintain that edge. Another group may not track these events closely yet still feel indirect effects. Economic shifts, trade adjustments, or policy changes influenced by infrastructure and resource strategies can shape job markets, prices, and investment climates far beyond the region where they originate. For them, preparation is less about analysis and more about flexibility, adjusting expectations, staying informed enough to recognize change, and remaining ready to adapt when conditions shift. There is also a third group that assumes such developments have little relevance to their lives. Because global structural stories can seem abstract, yet distance does not always equal insulation. When systems evolve, the consequences often travel through markets, supply chains, and political relationships before people notice their source. Ignoring signals does not stop their effects, it only delays awareness of them. Wherever someone falls among these groups, understanding the dynamics at play offers one shared benefit: it reduces surprise. And in periods of rapid change, reduced surprise is a powerful form of preparedness. Solutions cannot remain slogans once a structural shift is underway. When a system begins changing in visible ways, the real test is whether responses match that change with concrete action rather than commentary. But who must act first, what must be done, and how progress should be measured? Ibrahim Traoré enters the frame, because any strategy tied to national direction ultimately depends on decisions made at the leadership level. At the central authority level, the first priority is institutional clarity. Decision-makers must define which sectors receive accelerated investment, set timelines for delivery, and publish measurable benchmarks so progress can be verified rather than assumed. Success can be tracked through indicators such as completed infrastructure segments, audited revenue capture, and publicly documented expenditure flows. When those metrics are visible, confidence tends to stabilize because performance is no longer judged only by announcements. Organizations and businesses form the second layer of execution. Their role is to translate policy direction into operational reality by aligning logistics, training, procurement, and maintenance systems with new timelines. Implementation can be measured through efficiency indicators, reduced transport time, lower operating costs, or increased output consistency. When institutional goals and operational capability move together, momentum becomes easier to sustain. Communities and individuals represent the third layer, and their participation is practical rather than symbolic. Learning technical skills and engaging with emerging opportunities are actions that convert national initiatives into lived outcomes. Progress at this level can be observed through employment participation, skill certification, and local economic activity that reflects improved connectivity. A for 3 enforcing step can strengthen the entire framework: transparent communication, public reporting, and accessible explanations of policy decisions help maintain trust while changes unfold. An independent verification of results. Plans alone do not shape outcomes, implementation does. Think back for a moment to the earliest scene, when the first machines rolled onto open ground and observers realized something unusual was beginning to unfold. That image, quiet but decisive, became a reference point because it marked the instant when expectation shifted into evidence. Ibrahim Traoré was part of that turning point, not as a distant figure, but as someone associated with the decision that set events in motion. Since then, the path traced through data, timelines, debate, and consequences has revealed how a single initiative can grow into a broader reflection about systems, priorities, and possibilities. What began as a question about one project gradually unfolded into a larger exploration of how structures change, how assumptions are tested, and how outcomes emerge when conditions align. But by accumulation, step after step, signal after signal, until the pattern became visible. At its core, the story carries a human dimension beyond policy or economics. It speaks to the tension between doubt and belief, between inherited limits and attempted breakthroughs, between caution and momentum. Moments like this matter because they show how decisions, once made, ripple outward into realities that shape people's daily lives, opportunities, and expectations for the future. This was never just about a road. It was about the moment a possibility became real. By this point, different viewers will carry different impressions, and that is natural. Others a developing experiment, and others still a case study worth watching closely. Each interpretation reflects a perspective shaped by experience, priorities, and expectations. What matters is not that everyone agrees, but that the conversation continues with depth rather than assumptions. If this story felt worth your attention, it may also be worth letting others examine it with the same context, so more people can evaluate the full picture instead of only fragments. Discussions built on shared understanding tend to be more thoughtful, more balanced, and more useful than reactions formed from headlines alone. Insight grows stronger when it circulates. So the real question is simple, and it belongs to you as much as to anyone observing events from afar. Which factor do you think will matter most in determining how this story ultimately unfolds?